Many years ago, a group of missionaries quietly approached the room of a man they had grown curious about. They had heard the stories. They had heard that he prayed 4 hours. Some even said he prayed through the entire night. So one evening, they decided to see for themselves. As they stood outside his door, they heard something unusual. Inside the room, a voice was crying out in deep anguish. Not shouting, not preaching, but pleading. Over and over again, they heard the same words. "Give me souls, Lord. Give me souls." When they finally opened the door, they saw him kneeling on the floor, tears streaming down his face, completely unaware that anyone was watching. That man was John Hyde. The world would later know him by another name. Praying Hyde, a missionary whose life became so consumed with prayer that doctors later discovered his heart had physically shifted in his chest from countless hours leaning forward on his knees. But who was this man? Why did he pray with such intensity? And how did one quiet missionary help ignite spiritual awakening across India? In this video, we're going to uncover the extraordinary story of John Hyde, the man who spent his entire life on his knees in prayer. But before we begin, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear this story. Because stories like this remind us that one life fully surrendered to God can change far more than we imagine. Now, let's step into the remarkable story of Praying Hyde. In the quiet countryside of 19th century America, a boy was born who would one day become known around the world by a name that sounded almost mythical. They called him Praying Hyde, but that title did not come easily. It was not given because he enjoyed prayer. It was not earned through religious duty. And it certainly was not the result of an easy spiritual life. It came from a life that seemed to revolve around one simple, relentless practice, kneeling, hour after hour, day after day, year after year, until his very body began to bear the marks of a man who had wrestled with heaven. His real name was John Nelson Hyde, and when he was born in 1865 in Carthage, Illinois, nothing about his early life suggested he would become one of the most intense intercessors. His father was a Presbyterian minister. His home was filled with scripture, prayer, and religious discipline. Yet even in such an environment, the young John did not immediately appear to be the spiritual giant people would later imagine. In fact, in many ways, he was the opposite. He was quiet, reserved, deeply introspective, and often burdened by a sense that he did not measure up to the expectations around him. From an early age, Hyde struggled with feelings of spiritual inadequacy. He believed in God. He respected the faith of his family, but he constantly questioned whether his own faith was strong enough. Where others seemed confident, Hyde often felt painfully aware of his own weakness. This inner tension followed him into his young adulthood. He attended McCormick Theological Seminary in Chicago, preparing for ministry. But even during his theological studies, Hyde felt something deeper stirring inside him. It was not simply a desire to preach. It was not merely the ambition to become a respected pastor. Instead, there was a growing conviction that God was calling him somewhere far beyond. At the time, missionary movements were spreading across the Protestant world. Stories of distant nations filled church gatherings. Accounts of unreached people groups stirred the imaginations of young believers. For Hyde, these stories did more than inspire curiosity. They awakened a sense of destiny. He began to feel drawn toward India. India, at the time, was one of the most challenging mission fields in the world. The British Empire ruled the land politically, but spiritually, the country remained deeply rooted in ancient religions and cultural traditions that had existed for thousands of years. Missionaries who went there often faced intense hardship, disease, isolation, spiritual resistance, and sometimes overwhelming discouragement. Many who arrived full of zeal eventually returned home broken and defeated. Yet despite these realities, Hyde could not escape the growing conviction that his life was meant to be spent there. In 1892, at the age of 27, He made the decision that would permanently alter his life. He sailed for India as a missionary. The journey itself was long and exhausting. Weeks passed on the ocean before he finally arrived on the shores of a land that was completely unfamiliar to him. The languages were different. The culture was different. The climate was different. Even the spiritual landscape felt foreign. India was a place filled with temples, sacred rivers, and rituals that had been practiced for centuries. For Hyde, the challenge was immediate and overwhelming. He began working among the people of Punjab in northern India. His goal was simple: preach the gospel, win souls, build churches. It was the same strategy many missionaries had attempted before him. But almost immediately, Hyde encountered a reality that shook him deeply. Very few people responded. He preached. Almost no one converted. He shared the message of Christ, but the audiences remained distant and unmoved. Weeks turned into months, months turned into years. Still, the results were painfully small. For many missionaries, this would have been the moment when discouragement slowly extinguished the flame of their calling. But Hyde's response was different. Instead of retreating into frustration, he began asking a question that would reshape the rest of his life. What if the problem was not the message? What if the problem was not the people? What if the real issue was something far deeper? What if the missing ingredient was prayer? Not ordinary prayer, not quick devotional moments, but the kind of prayer that shakes the unseen world. The kind of prayer that wrestles with God until something breaks open in the spiritual realm. At first, the idea seemed extreme. Even among missionaries, Hyde's growing passion for prayer began to stand out. While others spent their days planning strategies and organizing outreach efforts, Hyde increasingly withdrew into hours of quiet intercession. He would kneel alone for long stretches of time, sometimes through the night, sometimes through entire days. He began praying not only for individual conversions, but for an outpouring of spiritual awakening across the entire region. Friends and fellow missionaries noticed something changing in him. His prayers were not casual. They were intense, persistent, almost desperate. He prayed with a sense that the fate of souls depended on it, and in many ways, he believed it did. But as Hyde pressed deeper into this life of intercession, the course began to reveal itself. His health began to weaken. Long hours of prayer exhausted his already fragile body. India's harsh climate took its toll, and yet, the deeper Hyde went into prayer, the more convinced he became that this was exactly where he needed to be. He was beginning to discover a truth that few people ever fully embrace, that sometimes the greatest spiritual battles are not fought in public. They are fought alone, on the knees, in silence, far away from applause, and Hyde was only at the beginning of that battle. The quiet missionary who struggled to win even a single convert was about to enter a season of prayer so intense, it would eventually earn him a name remembered across the world, a name that would define the rest of his life. Praying Hyde. But the road to becoming that man would take him through deeper valleys than he could yet imagine. And before revival would come, Hyde would first have to learn how to wrestle with God. And that wrestling was only just beginning. The quiet missionary who struggled to see even a single convert had reached a turning point. John Hyde had come to India believing that preaching would change lives, but after years of effort with almost no visible results, he began to realize something that many missionaries before him had overlooked. Words alone were not enough. Strategies alone were not enough. If hearts were going to change in a land saturated with centuries of religious tradition, something deeper had to happen first. The spiritual atmosphere itself had to shift. And Hyde became convinced that only prayer could do that. Not casual prayer, not polite prayers offered before meals or meetings, but the kind of prayer that refuses to let go until heaven responds. So Hyde began to reorganize his entire life around intercession. While other missionaries focused on teaching, organizing schools, or building institutions, Hyde increasingly withdrew into his hours of intense prayer. Sometimes he would kneel for half the night. Other times he would pray through the entire night without sleeping at all. Those who knew him began noticing a pattern. Hyde did not pray like someone completing a religious obligation. He prayed like someone fighting a battle. His prayers were often filled with tears. Sometimes he would groan aloud, burdened by the weight he felt for the souls around him. At times he seemed almost physically shaken by the intensity of his intercession. It was as though Hyde believed that somewhere beyond the visible world, an unseen conflict was taking place, and prayer was the weapon that could turn the tide. But prayer is rarely easy, especially the kind Hyde was pursuing. There were long seasons where nothing seemed to change. He prayed 4 hours, still no converts. He prayed 4 days, still no breakthrough. For many people, that kind of silence would have ended the experiment. But Hyde pressed deeper. He began praying not just for individuals, but for revival across the entire region of Punjab. He asked God to pour out spiritual awakening in a way that missionaries alone could never manufacture. And slowly, quietly, something began to happen. Hyde was not the only missionary in Punjab who felt the burden for deeper prayer. A small group of workers began gathering together with him, united by the same conviction that the mission field needed more than activity. It needed spiritual power. Out of these gatherings emerged what became known as the Punjab Prayer Union. Their purpose was simple. They would pray. Specifically, they would pray for the annual missionary gatherings where the gospel would be preached to large crowds. But Hyde's prayers went far beyond general requests for blessing. He began making very specific petitions. At one point, he prayed for something that seemed almost impossible. He asked God for 1 soul per day. Not vague spiritual influence, not general encouragement. 1 person, every day, coming to Christ. To Hyde, this request was not about numbers. It was about faith. He believed that if prayer truly moved heaven, then prayer should produce visible results. And so he prayed, day after day, night after night. And then something remarkable happened. People began responding. At first the changes were small. A few individuals showed interest in the message. Some began asking questions about Christ. Then conversions started happening. 1 soul, then another, then another. Hyde watched in awe as the very thing he had asked for began to unfold. But instead of becoming satisfied, his faith grew even bolder. If God could give 1 soul per day, why not 2? So Hyde returned to prayer. Again he wrestled, again he pleaded. Again he refused to let go. And slowly, the results began increasing. More people came forward, more hearts opened. The gatherings where missionaries preached began to see unexpected responses. What had once been dry and discouraging meetings suddenly carried a sense of spiritual urgency. People listened differently. Something in the atmosphere had changed. Those who worked alongside Hyde began noticing that the shift seemed directly connected to his hidden life of prayer. While others preached publicly, Hyde often remained in a nearby room or quiet place, praying intensely throughout the meetings. Sometimes he prayed 4 hours while others spoke. Sometimes he continued praying long after the crowds had left. He rarely sought attention for it. In fact, many people attending the meetings had no idea that while sermons were being delivered, a solitary missionary was kneeling somewhere nearby, pleading with God for their souls. But Hyde's faith continued to grow. If God could answer 1 prayer for 1 soul per day, then perhaps the harvest could be even greater. Eventually Hyde began praying for 4 souls per day. For many people, such a request would sound unrealistic. But Hyde had already seen enough to believe that prayer could move beyond human calculations. And once again, the unexpected began to happen. Conversions multiplied. Entire gatherings began responding to the message of Christ. Some missionaries who had labored 4 years without results suddenly saw people coming forward in numbers they had never witnessed before. Whispers began spreading among the mission community. Something unusual was happening in Punjab. But while others spoke about revival, Hyde remained focused on one thing: prayer. The more answers he saw, The deeper he went, the more souls responded, the longer he prayed. Sometimes he spent entire nights interceding. Sometimes he prayed until physical exhaustion forced him to stop. Friends began worrying about his health. Hyde was never physically strong to begin with. Now the strain of such intense spiritual discipline was taking a visible toll. His body grew weaker, his heart struggled under the pressure. Yet Hyde seemed almost indifferent to the cost. For him, the question was simple. If prayer could bring souls into the kingdom of God, then what sacrifice was too great? But few people understood just how far Hyde was willing to go. Because the deeper he went into this life of intercession, the more it began to reshape every part of him. His schedule, his strength, even his physical body. The missionary who had once struggled to see a single convert was now becoming known for something far more unusual. A man who appeared to live almost entirely on his knees. But the most extraordinary chapter of Hyde's life was still ahead, because the intensity of his prayers was about to reach a level that would astonish even those who believed in the power of intercession, and the man the world would eventually call Praying Hyde was only beginning to reveal how far a single life devoted to prayer could go. By the early years of the 20th century, something unusual was happening in northern India. Missionaries who had once labored for years with little visible fruit began witnessing something they had rarely seen before. People were responding, not just politely listening, not just asking curious questions. They were surrendering their lives to Christ, in village gatherings, in mission meetings, and in crowded conference halls. Individuals began stepping forward with a seriousness that startled even experienced workers. And behind much of this spiritual movement was a man few people fully understood. John Hyde. By now, his reputation among missionaries had quietly begun to grow. Some had seen glimpses of his prayer life. Others had simply heard stories. Stories of a man who prayed late into the night. Stories of a man who seemed burdened by the spiritual condition of India in a way that went far beyond ordinary concern. But the full extent of Hyde's devotion to prayer was known only to those who had observed him closely. And what they saw was astonishing. Hyde did not treat prayer as a daily ritual. He treated it as his primary calling. Sometimes he prayed through the entire night. Sometimes he remained on his knees for so long that friends feared he would collapse from exhaustion. There were occasions when those nearby could hear him crying out to God with a depth of emotion that was difficult to describe. Not theatrical, not performative, but deeply personal, as though he were carrying the spiritual weight of thousands of souls. Those who shared rooms or buildings near him would sometimes hear his voice in the darkness, pleading again and again for people by name. He prayed for villages. He prayed for specific individuals. He prayed for entire regions that had never heard the gospel. At times his prayers were quiet whispers. At other times they were desperate cries. One missionary later described it as listening to a man travailing in prayer. The phrase came from Scripture, where prayer is sometimes compared to the labor pains of childbirth. The idea that something spiritual was being born through intense intercession. Hyde seemed to embody that image, but such a life of relentless prayer began to affect him physically. His health, already fragile, began to deteriorate. The strain of long hours without rest, combined with harsh conditions of missionary life in India, took a heavy toll. Eventually doctors discovered something alarming. His heart had shifted inside his chest. Years of leaning forward in intense prayer had actually caused his heart to move slightly out of its natural position. It was a condition so unusual that physicians struggled to explain it. For many people, such a diagnosis would have forced immediate change. Doctors warned him that continuing at this pace could shorten his life. Friends urged him to rest. Mission leaders encouraged him to protect his health. But Hyde's response revealed just how deeply prayer had become the center of his existence. If prayer was the means through which God was bringing people into salvation, then Hyde felt he could not abandon it. He did not ignore the warnings completely. He understood the risks. but neither could he step away from what he believed God had called him to do. So the prayers continued, night after night, year after year, and with every passing season, the results seemed to grow. During the annual missionary conferences in Punjab, Hyde often dedicated entire days and nights to intercession before the meetings even began. While others prepared sermons or organized schedules, Hyde prayed, sometimes alone, sometimes with a small group of believers. They asked God to move among the crowds. They asked for conviction of sin. They asked for hearts to be opened. And again, something remarkable followed. People responded, not just a few, sometimes dozens. Sometimes far more than anyone expected. Missionaries who attended these gatherings often remarked that the atmosphere felt different. There was a sense of seriousness, a sense that people were encountering something beyond mere words. And Hyde remained in the background through it all. While others preached publicly, he frequently stayed in a nearby room, praying intensely while the meetings were taking place. On some occasions, messengers would quietly slip into the prayer room to tell Hyde what was happening. People are coming forward, more are responding. Another group has asked to speak with the missionaries. Each report seemed only to deepen Hyde's prayers. Instead of celebrating, he prayed harder. Because for Hyde, every soul represented an eternal reality. Every conversion mattered. And every person who walked away without responding mattered just as much. But the deeper Hyde went into this life of intercession, the more people began noticing something about him. There was a gentleness in his presence, a humility that seemed untouched by the growing stories surrounding him. Despite the whispers of revival and the increasing reputation of his prayer life, Hyde never presented himself as a spiritual hero. If anything, he seemed even more aware of his own weakness. He often spoke about his dependence on God, about the impossibility of changing hearts through human effort alone, and about the absolute necessity of prayer. Yet those who observed him closely sometimes felt that Hyde was living in a spiritual reality that few people ever experienced. It was not unusual for him to suddenly withdraw from conversations to pray, not because he was being impolite, but because the burden of intercession seemed to rise unexpectedly within him. Friends would sometimes find him alone in quiet corners, kneeling with tears in his eyes. The line between ordinary life and prayer had almost disappeared, and Hyde appeared increasingly consumed by one desire, that people would encounter Christ. But while the results of his prayers were visible in the growing number of conversions across Punjab, the physical cost continued to mount. His body grew weaker, fatigue followed him constantly, and those closest to him began wondering how long he could continue, because the life Hyde had chosen was not sustainable by ordinary human strength. And soon the toll of years spent in relentless prayer would push his body to its limit. But even as his strength faded, Hyde's burden for prayer did not diminish. If anything, it intensified. Because the man who had spent years asking God for one soul per day was now praying for something even greater, a spiritual awakening that would reach far beyond the villages of Punjab, a movement that would spread across nations. And Hyde believed that if such a revival was going to come, it would begin the same way every true awakening begins. Not with crowds, not with sermons, but with someone kneeling in prayer. And for Hyde, that someone was himself. By this point, John Hyde had become something of a mystery among missionaries across India. Stories about him circulated quietly through mission stations, conferences, and church gatherings. Some people spoke about the unusual results surrounding the meetings where he prayed. Others described the intensity of his intercession. But one detail appeared in almost every account. Hyde seemed to live on his knees. It was not merely a habit. It was not simply a spiritual discipline. It was the atmosphere of his life. Those who shared close proximity with him often observed that Hyde seemed most comfortable in prayer. Conversations might end with him quietly withdrawing to kneel. Moments of free time were rarely spent in leisure. Instead, Hyde returned again and again to the same posture, that had defined his life in India, kneeling, seeking, wrestling, and slowly, almost without intention, people began calling him something that would follow him for the rest of his life: Praying Hyde. The name was not meant to glorify him. It was simply the most accurate description anyone could think of, because Hyde prayed in a way that seemed to go far beyond ordinary devotion. There were nights when he remained in prayer until dawn. Sometimes those nearby would hear him softly repeating the same petitions. At other times, his prayers became deeply emotional, marked by tears and broken cries. Witnesses later said it felt as though Hyde was carrying an invisible burden that few others could fully understand. But as the years passed, the results connected to his prayers continued to grow. Mission conferences that had once struggled to produce interest began experiencing moments of profound spiritual response. Crowds gathered, people listened with unusual seriousness, and when the invitation was given for those who wanted to commit their lives to Christ, individuals often came forward in numbers. Many who observed these meetings believed Hyde's prayers were preparing the ground long before the sermons were preached. In fact, Hyde himself often spent entire nights praying before these gatherings began. While others rested or prepared their messages, Hyde would withdraw to intercede. He prayed that hearts would be opened. He prayed that pride would be broken. He prayed that people would see Christ clearly. And sometimes, during the meetings themselves, Hyde would remain in a nearby room rather than sitting in the audience. While the preaching took place, he prayed. When the invitation was given, he prayed. When people came forward in response, he prayed even more. For Hyde, the visible moments of revival were only the surface of something deeper. Behind every conversion, he believed there had to be a spiritual struggle, and prayer was the place where that struggle was fought. But as Hyde's reputation grew, so did concern for his health. Years of intense intercession had already taken a significant toll on his body. Doctors had warned him that his heart had shifted due to the physical strain of long hours leaning forward in prayer. The condition was dangerous. They advised him to reduce his activity, to rest more, to protect what strength he had left. Yet Hyde struggled with the idea of slowing down. For him, prayer was not merely a practice he could pause when it became inconvenient. It was the very center of his calling. And if prayer was the means through which souls were being reached, then stepping away felt almost unthinkable. Friends began noticing how thin he had become. Fatigue often showed in his face. Sometimes even simple tasks seemed to drain his strength. Yet, when Hyde knelt to pray, something seemed to awaken within him. It was as though the weakness of his body disappeared for a moment. The burden for souls remained stronger than the limits of his physical condition. During one season of prayer, Hyde felt led to make an even bolder request of God. He prayed that entire communities would be touched by the gospel. Not just individuals, not just small groups, but whole villages turning toward Christ. And once again, the unexpected began happening. Reports spread of families responding together, of gatherings where multiple people surrendered their lives to God, of spiritual conversations beginning in places where missionaries had previously encountered indifference. For Hyde, these moments were not evidence of personal success. They were confirmations that prayer truly mattered, that unseen battles were being fought, and that God was able to do far more than human effort alone could accomplish. Yet the years of relentless intercession continued to push Hyde's body toward its limits. By the early 1910s, his health had deteriorated significantly. He experienced increasing weakness, simple activities became difficult, and eventually it became clear that he could not continue living in India indefinitely. Reluctantly, Hyde agreed to return to America for medical care and rest. But even during the journey home, prayer remained the center of his life. Passengers on the ship noticed the quiet missionary spending long hours alone in prayer. He prayed for India. He prayed for the missionaries he had left behind. He prayed that the work God had begun would continue long after he had gone. When Hyde finally arrived back in the United States, Doctors examined his condition carefully. Their conclusion was sobering. His heart was severely weakened. Years of strain had left lasting damage, and the prognosis was uncertain. For Hyde, however, the diagnosis did not bring bitterness. If anything, it brought a quiet sense of completion. He had come to India with a simple desire: to see souls come to Christ. And through years of prayer, he had witnessed far more than he ever imagined possible. The missionary, who once struggled to see even a single convert, had helped ignite movements of spiritual awakening that touched countless lives. But the final chapter of Hyde's life was approaching, and though his body was failing, the burden of prayer had not left him. Even in weakness, even in pain, the man known as Praying Hyde continued to kneel. Because for him, prayer was never merely an activity. It was the place where heaven and earth met, and Hyde intended to remain there for as long as he had breath. When John Hyde returned to the United States, it was clear to those around him that his strength was fading. Years of intense prayer, physical strain, and the harsh conditions of missionary life in India had taken a severe toll on his body. The man who had spent countless nights wrestling in prayer now carried the visible marks of exhaustion. Doctors examined him carefully and delivered the sobering truth: his heart was severely damaged. The unusual shift in its position inside his chest, combined with years of relentless strain, had weakened it to a dangerous degree. They told him what no one wanted to hear: his body could not endure much longer. For many people, such news would have brought despair. Others might have responded with regret, wondering whether they had pushed themselves too far. But Hyde did neither. Those who visited him his final months often remarked on the quiet peace that surrounded him. He did not appear bitter. He did not speak of wasted strength. Instead, there was a sense that Hyde believed his life had been spent exactly where it needed to be. In prayer, even in his weakened condition, he continued to pray. Friends who spent time with him noticed that the habit of kneeling had never left him. Though his body was fragile, the instinct to intercede remained deeply rooted within him. He prayed for India. He prayed for the missionaries who continued working there. He prayed that the seeds planted through years of prayer would continue to grow. But Hyde also spoke often about something else during this time. He spoke about dependence on God. Throughout his life, he had become convinced of a truth that many believers acknowledge, but few truly live by. Human effort alone cannot change hearts. Programs cannot produce spiritual awakening. Strategies cannot manufacture revival. Only God can do that. And prayer is the place where human weakness meets divine power. Hyde had spent years proving that truth through his own life. He had arrived in India as a missionary struggling to see even a single convert. Yet through relentless prayer, he had witnessed remarkable changes. Mission gatherings, once marked by discouragement, had begun experiencing powerful responses. Individuals, families, and communities had encountered the message of Christ. Many missionaries later testified that Hyde's hidden life of intercession had shaped the spiritual atmosphere of their work in ways they could never fully measure. But Hyde himself never claimed credit for any of it. If people praised his prayer life, he often responded with humility. He believed the real story was not about a man who prayed. It was about a God who answered. On February 17, 1912, John Hyde passed away at the age of 46. His life had been relatively short. By most standards, his years were fewer than many missionaries who labored for decades. Yet the influence of his life extended far beyond the number of years he lived. Because Hyde had demonstrated something rare. He had shown what can happen when a person gives themselves entirely to prayer. In the years following his death, the stories about Praying Hyde continued to circulate throughout missionary circles. Accounts of his intense intercession inspired believers across the world. Some were amazed by the physical endurance he displayed. Others were deeply moved by the spiritual burden he carried. But perhaps the most powerful aspect of Hyde's story was its simplicity. He was not known primarily for sermons. He did not establish a large organization. He did not write famous theological books. Instead, His life was defined by something quiet and unseen: prayer, a man on his knees, a heart burdened for souls, and a relentless belief that God hears when people pray. For many who later reflected on Hyde's life, one question began to emerge. What would happen if more believers prayed the way he did? What if prayer was treated not as a brief religious duty, but as a genuine spiritual struggle? What if people were willing to spend hours, not minutes, seeking God for the salvation of others? The life of praying Hyde challenges those questions even today, because his story confronts modern assumptions about where true spiritual power comes from. In an age filled with technology, strategies, and endless information, Hyde's life points back to something far simpler and far deeper: the quiet place of prayer, where no audience is present, where no recognition is given, where the only conversation taking place is between a human heart and the God who created it. John Hyde believed that place mattered more than anything else, and his life became the evidence. He knelt in small rooms, he prayed through the night. He wept for people he had never met. He carried the burden of entire communities before God, and in ways that cannot always be measured, heaven responded. Today, more than a century later, the name Praying Hyde still echoes through Christian history, not because of public achievements, but because of a private devotion that reshaped lives across continents. And perhaps the most important question his story leaves behind is not simply what Hyde accomplished. The deeper question is this: what might God be willing to do today, if someone were willing to pray like that again? Because the story of John Hyde is not merely about the past. It is a reminder that the power of prayer has never disappeared. The same God Hyde prayed to is still listening, still working, still responding. And somewhere, even now, the next chapter of that story may begin the same way Hyde's did, with someone quietly kneeling and refusing to stop praying. The story of John Hyde is not merely the story of a missionary. It is the story of a man who discovered a secret many overlook: that the greatest battles in history are often fought in quiet rooms, on humble knees, far away from applause. Hyde did not build a famous institution. He did not write volumes of theology. Yet through relentless prayer, countless lives were touched, hearts were transformed, and entire communities encountered the message of Christ. His life reminds us that true spiritual power does not begin on platforms, but in prayer. Long after his voice fell silent, the echoes of his intercession continued shaping the mission fields of India. And his story leaves us with a question that still echoes today: what might happen if someone prayed like that again? If this story inspired you, like this video, subscribe to the channel, share it with others, and drop a comment below about what touched you most.